The first thing Annie Sawyer heard when she stepped off the wagon wasn't a welcome. It was laughter. Not the warm kind, the kind that cuts deep before you even understand why. A group of men leaned against the wooden post outside Pine Creek cabin, boots crossed, eyes sharp beneath dusty hats. One of them spat into the dirt and tilted his head. "That her?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's the mail-order bride Chevy Montana paid for." Another man let out a dry chuckle, dragging his gaze over Annie like she was something returned from a bad trade. "Ain't what he described," he muttered. Annie froze, her worn suitcase hanging loosely from trembling fingers. What she didn't know, what made the laughter sting even more, was that Pine Creek had been waiting for her. Chevy had talked, loudly, bragging in the cabin for weeks about the woman he had coming, painting pictures of beauty, grace, something almost unreal. And the postmaster, who read every letter that passed through his hands, had only helped spread the story further. By the time Annie arrived, she wasn't a stranger. She was a disappointment. Annie swallowed hard, forcing her feet to stay planted, even as every instinct told her to turn around and leave. But there was nowhere to go. Behind her stretched miles of empty land and a past she couldn't return to. Ahead of her stood Pine Creek, a place that was supposed to be her new beginning. Instead, it felt like a stage where she had arrived too late, already judged, before she spoke a single word. The laughter lingered, echoing in her ears and mixing with the dry wind that carried dust across her skin like a quiet reminder that she didn't belong. The cabin door creaked open behind her, cutting through the noise, and a tall woman stepped out, wiping her hands on a worn apron. Her name was Clara Voss, though Annie didn't know that yet. What she noticed first was the way the woman's eyes softened for just a second before life pulled them back into something guarded. "You Annie?" she asked simply. Annie nodded, her voice caught somewhere deep in her throat. Clara glanced past her, scanning the empty road. No horse, no rider, no sign of Chevy Montana. Just silence stretching under a fading orange sky. Clara let out a slow breath, like she had seen this kind of thing before. "He ain't coming," she said, not cruelly, just plainly. The words hit harder than the laughter ever could. Annie's fingers tightened around her suitcase. "Maybe he's late," she whispered, though even she didn't believe it anymore. Clara shook her head once. "Men like Chevy don't run late. They run away." The wind rose again, brushing dust across Annie's face, as if the land itself was reminding her of the truth. She had come all this way for a man who didn't want her. And somewhere, unseen among the watching eyes of Pine Creek, someone else had already taken notice of her. Before we go further, if you're already feeling this story, don't just watch it. Be part of it. Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and trust me, you're part of this journey too. Now let's get back to Annie, because what happens next, you won't see it coming. Weeks earlier, Annie Sawyer had sat by a small window in a quiet boarding room miles away from Pine Creek, her fingers tracing the edges of a letter she had already read more times than she could count. The paper was worn at the folds, softened by hope and hesitation. Chevy Montana's words had been confident, almost too confident. He wrote about land, wide, open, full of promise. He wrote about needing a wife, not just for work, but for companionship. A strong woman, he had said. Someone who knows hardship and still stands. Annie had paused at that line the first time she read it, something inside her tightening. It wasn't romance, not really, but it felt honest. and honesty was something her life had been missing for a long time. She had no family left to lean on, no place that felt like home. So when the offer came, it didn't feel like a gamble. It felt like the only door still open. What Annie didn't see, what she couldn't see, was the way Chevy had written those same kinds of words before, to others who never made it as far as she did. The day she left, the sky had been gray, heavy with the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Annie carried everything she owned in a single suitcase, the weight of it, less than the weight, pressing against her chest. There had been no one to say goodbye, no one to ask her to stay. Just the sound of her own footsteps as she climbed onto the wagon that would take her west. The driver had barely looked at her, only nodding once, as if he had seen this story play out too many times already. The journey was long, stretching across empty land that seemed to swallow time itself. Days blurred into nights, my nights into restless sleep under unfamiliar skies. Along the way, Annie held on to the image Chevy had painted for her. A small home, steady work, a place where she wouldn't feel invisible. But there were moments, quiet ones, where doubt slipped in, a glance from another traveler, a silence where there should have been reassurance. Still, she kept going, because turning back meant facing a life that had already closed its doors on her. What Annie didn't know was that back in Pine Creek, Chevy Montana wasn't preparing for her arrival. He was avoiding it. The same men who laughed at the cabin had been there the night before, watching him drink more than usual, his confidence cracking at the edges. "You really gonna marry her?" one of them had asked, half amused. Chevy had scoffed, waving it off like it was nothing. "Team was just talk," he said, though his voice didn't carry the same weight it used to. "Ain't no way I'm tying myself to some woman I ain't even seen." The room had filled with low laughter, but there was something uneasy beneath it. Because deep down, even they knew this wasn't just talk. A letter had been sent. Money had been exchanged. A promise had been made. And instead of facing it, Chevy chose the easier path. By the time the sun rose the next morning, he was gone, leaving behind nothing but whispers, expectations, and a woman who had no idea she was walking straight into humiliation. That first night in Pine Creek didn't feel real to Annie. It felt like something she was watching from a distance, like her body had arrived, but the rest of her was still somewhere on that long road behind her. Clara Voss didn't ask many questions. She simply nodded toward the side of the cabin and said, "You can stay. For now." The room Annie stepped into was small, with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a window that barely held back the wind. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. And right now, that was more than Annie had. She set her suitcase down slowly, her movements careful, like if she rushed, the fragile sense of stability might break. Outside, laughter still drifted faintly through the walls, reminding her that the town hadn't forgotten her arrival. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her hands, the skin dry from travel, the faint tremble she couldn't quite control. This wasn't how it was supposed to begin, but for the first time since stepping off that wagon, she allowed herself to breathe. Morning came quickly, carrying with it the sounds of Pine Creek waking up. Boots on wood, horses shifting, voices low and steady. Annie stepped outside, unsure of where she stood, in a place that hadn't exactly welcomed her. Clara was already working, moving with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years spent surviving rather than living. "If you're staying," Clara said without looking at her, "you'll work." There was no harshness in her tone, just truth. Annie nodded immediately. "I can clean, cook a little. I learned fast, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Clara glanced at her then, studying her like she was deciding something important. After a moment, she gave a small nod. Then start with the tables. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't cruelty either. It was something in between, something earned. Annie moved quickly, wiping down surfaces, keeping her head low as men came and went. Some ignored her, others watched, their curiosity sharp but quieter now. The laughter from the day before had faded, but the judgment hadn't. It was near midday when the cabin door swung open harder than usual, the sound cutting through the steady rhythm of the room. Conversation slowed. Boots paused. Annie glanced up without thinking, and saw him. He stood in the doorway like he didn't belong to the same dust-covered world as everyone else. Tall, broad-shouldered, his coat worn but not careless, and his hat pulled low enough to shadow his face. There was something different about him, not in what he wore, but in how he carried it. Like the weight on his shoulders wasn't just from the road. His arm was wrapped tightly with cloth, darkened in places where blood had seeped through. He didn't speak right away, just stepped inside, slow, deliberate, his eyes scanning the room once before settling on Annie. Not in the way the others had looked at her, not with judgment, not with amusement, just steady, observing, measuring. Clara noticed it too. You're hurt, she said, stepping forward. The man gave a slight nod. It's nothing, he replied, though his voice carried the kind of exhaustion that said otherwise. Annie hesitated only for a second, before moving closer, something instinctive pulling her forward. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but as she reached for the cloth around his arm, something told her this moment was about to change everything. Annie's fingers hesitated for only a second, before gently touching the cloth wrapped around the stranger's arm. Up close, she could see how badly it had been tied. Hurried, uneven, meant to stop bleeding, not heal it. Sit, she said softly, her voice calm in a way that surprised even her. The man didn't argue. He pulled out a chair and lowered himself into it with a quiet heaviness, like the weight he carried wasn't just from the injury. Clara brought over a small basin of water without a word, setting it down beside Annie before stepping back. The room had gone quieter now, not out of kindness, but curiosity. Annie carefully began unwrapping the cloth, her movements slow, steady. The wound beneath made her breath catch. It was deep, angry, not something that came from a simple fall. The man watched her, not flinching, not speaking, his eyes fixed on her hands like he was trying to understand something beyond the pain. You should have had this cleaned sooner, she murmured. He gave a faint shrug. Didn't have the time. His voice was low, controlled, but there was something beneath it, something guarded. She worked in silence after that, cleaning the wound with careful precision, ignoring the faint tremble in her fingers. It wasn't fear. It was focus. The kind she had learned from a life where mistakes had consequences. Around them, the cabin slowly returned to its rhythm, though the glances didn't stop. Annie could feel them, but she didn't look up. For the first time since arriving in Pine Creek, she wasn't thinking about the laughter or Chevy or the way she had been seen. She was thinking about something in front of her, something real. "What's your name?" she asked finally, tying fresh cloth around his arm. The man was quiet for a moment, like the question carried more weight than it should. Then, simply, "Denver. No first name. No explanation. Just that." Annie nodded slightly. "I'm Annie." He gave a small acknowledgement, but his eyes didn't leave her face, not in a way that made her uncomfortable. but in a way that felt like he was seeing something no one else had bothered to look for. When she finished, she stepped back, wiping her hands on a cloth. "You'll need to rest," she said, "and keep it clean this time." There was the faintest hint of firmness in her tone now, like something stronger than the quiet uncertainty she had carried the day before. Denver noticed it. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face before he reached into his coat, pulling out a few worn bills and placing them on the table. Annie glanced at the money, then back at him. "You don't have to," she started, but he cut her off with a small shake of his head. "I do." His voice was still calm, but there was finality in it. Clara stepped forward then, taking the money without comment, but her eyes lingered on Denver a second longer than necessary, like she recognized something, or didn't quite believe what she was seeing. Denver stood slowly, adjusting his coat, his movements careful but controlled. Before turning away, his gaze found Annie again. "Thank you," he said quietly. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. The room slowly returned to its usual noise, but something had shifted. Annie remained still for a moment, her eyes fixed on the door. It wasn't just the wound, or the silence, or even the way he looked at her. It was something harder to name, something that didn't fit with the rough, predictable rhythm of Pine Creek. He hadn't laughed. He hadn't judged. He hadn't even asked questions. And in a place where everyone seemed to already know who you were before you spoke, that felt different. Different enough to stay with her. Denver didn't come back the next day, or the day after that. And Annie told herself it didn't matter. But something about the quiet felt different without him. Pine Creek went on the same way it always did. Boots on wood. Laughter that carried too far. Men talking like they owned every inch of dust beneath their feet. Annie worked from sunrise to nightfall, cleaning tables, carrying trays, learning the rhythm of a place that had no reason to make space for her. Clara spoke little, but she watched everything. And little by little, without saying it out loud, she began to trust Annie with more. Still, the memory of that moment lingered. The way Denver had looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. It wasn't something she was used to, and that made it harder to forget. By the third day, she caught herself glancing at the door more than once, not hoping, just noticing. Then, just as quietly as he had left, he returned. It was late afternoon when the door opened again, and this time, there was no dramatic entrance, no pause, no shift in the room. Just Denver, stepping inside like he had always belonged there, even though he clearly didn't. His arm was still wrapped, but cleaner now. Tighter. Someone had taken care of it properly. Annie noticed that first. Then the rest. His coat. Worn, yes, but made of stronger material than most men in Pine Creek would ever afford. His boots, dusty but solid, built to last, not patched together like the others. And the way he carried himself. Not proud, not loud, just certain, like a man who didn't need to prove anything. He took a seat at one of the back tables, away from the noise, away from the eyes that barely noticed him. Annie hesitated only a moment before walking over. "You didn't let it get worse," she said quietly, nodding toward his arm. Denver glanced at it briefly. "Took your advice," he replied. Simple. Direct. But there was something else there. Something that sounded almost like respect. She brought him food without asking. Something warm, something filling. He didn't question it, just nodded once before eating in silence. But Annie noticed things. Small things. The way he handled his fork, steady, practiced. Not rushed, not careless. The way he sat, alert, even while resting. And when he reached into his coat again to pay, She caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong in a place like this. Not money. She had seen that already. Something else. A folded piece of paper, thicker than usual, edged clean. Official. He noticed her glance and, for the briefest second, his hand paused before tucking it away again. Neither of them said anything about it, but the moment stayed. "You passing through?" Annie asked after a while, keeping her voice casual. Denver looked up at her then, his expression unreadable. "Something like that," he said. Not a lie, but not the truth either. And Annie felt it. There was more to him than he was willing to say. Much more. And for the first time since arriving in Pine Creek, curiosity replaced the quiet ache she had been carrying. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Annie hadn't expected to find so quickly. Work came first. Always. The scrape of chairs, the clink of plates, the constant movement that kept her from thinking too much. But now, there was something else woven into that rhythm. Denver. He didn't come every day, and when he did, he never stayed long. Always the same table, always quiet, always watching more than speaking. Annie never asked too many questions, but she noticed everything. The way his arm healed faster than it should have, like he knew how to care for wounds better than most. The way he carried himself even when sitting, never fully relaxed, like a man used to being ready. And once, just once, she saw him step outside and speak to a man passing through town. The exchange was brief, but it wasn't casual. There was a nod, a folded paper passed discreetly, and something about the way the other man stood, straight, respectful, felt wrong for someone like Denver. Or maybe, Annie thought quietly, she didn't know who someone like Denver really was. One evening, just before sunset, the cabin was quieter than usual. The sky outside burned with deep orange and fading gold, the kind of light that made everything look softer than it truly was. Denver sat at his usual table, untouched food in front of him. Annie noticed it immediately. "You're not eating," she said as she approached, her tone light but observant. He glanced at the plate, then back at her. Not hungry. It was the first time his answer didn't feel complete. Annie didn't move away. "That's a lie," she said gently, surprising both of them. For a moment, something shifted in his expression, something close to a reaction, but it was gone just as quickly. He leaned back slightly, studying her now, the way he had the first day. "You always call people out like that?" he asked. Annie shook her head. "No, just when it matters." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Not like before. Not like with the others. The silence felt steady. Real. After a moment, Denver reached for the food and took a bite. "Better?" Annie asked, a faint hint of a smile touching her lips. He didn't smile back, but something in his eyes softened. Later that night, after the last of the men had cleared out and the cabin had finally grown still, Annie stepped outside for a breath of air. The wind was cooler now, carrying the quiet hum of the open land beyond Pine Creek. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring out into the dark when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. "You work too much," Denver said, his voice low, almost blending into the night. Annie let out a soft breath. "I don't have much else to do." It wasn't said with bitterness, just truth. He stepped closer, stopping just beside her, his presence steady but not overwhelming. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, after a long silence, Annie said quietly, "You don't belong here." It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Denver didn't respond right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the dark horizon. "Neither do you," he said finally. Annie swallowed, her chest tightening slightly at the words. Not because they hurt, but because they felt too accurate. For the first time, she wasn't just being seen, she was being understood. But what Annie didn't realize was that whatever Denver had come to Pine Creek to leave behind was already catching up to him. The first sign that something was wrong came just after noon, when the usual rhythm of Pine Creek shifted in a way Annie couldn't quite explain. It wasn't loud at first, just different. Conversations slowed. A few men stepped outside, drawn by something unseen. Annie followed their glances through the window and saw it. Dust rising in the distance. Not the scattered kind carried by the wind. This was heavier, intentional. Riders. Her stomach tightened without reason, instinct pulling at something deep inside her. Clara noticed it too, her movement slowing just enough to show she was paying attention. "Stay inside," she muttered under her breath, though her eyes never left the horizon. But Annie didn't move, because before the riders even reached the edge of town, she felt it. Something was about to break. They came in fast, 3 men on horseback, their presence cutting through Pine Creek like they owned it. They weren't dressed like the men who usually passed through. Cleaner, sharper. Their coats carried dust, but not carelessness. The kind of men who traveled far, but not without purpose. The one in front dismounted first, his boots hitting the ground with a controlled weight. His gaze swept the area once, quick and precise, before settling on the cabin. Annie felt it even from where she stood. That look wasn't searching blindly. It was focused, deliberate. He stepped inside without hesitation, the other 2 following behind him. The room fell into a silence that wasn't natural. "We're looking for someone," the man said, his voice calm but edged with authority that didn't belong to this town. No one answered. No one needed to, some because in that moment, every eye shifted, just slightly, toward the back of the room. Denver didn't move at first. He sat there, still, like he had been expecting this, or at least not surprised by it. Annie's breath caught as she watched him, something cold creeping up her spine. This wasn't coincidence. This was connection. The man's gaze found him easily, a faint smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "James," he said, like the name carried history, like it mattered. Annie's chest tightened at the sound of it. James, not Denver, not the quiet stranger who kept to himself. Something else, something real. Denver. James slowly stood, his movements calm, controlled, but heavier now, different. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice lower than Annie had ever heard it. The man shrugged slightly, stepping closer. And yet, here we are. The tension in the room thickened, pressing down on everything. Annie didn't understand what was happening, but she understood enough. The silence, the names, the way Denver carried himself now. Not like a passing man, but like someone who had something to lose. And for the first time, she realized the truth she had only felt before. He hadn't been hiding from the town. He had been hiding from something much bigger. The silence in the cabin stretched so tight it felt like it might snap at any second. Annie stood frozen behind the counter, her heart pounding as the name echoed in her mind. James. It didn't fit the man she thought she knew, yet somehow it explained everything at the same time. The way he carried himself, the way others seemed to react to him without understanding why, the way he never truly answered a question. James Denver didn't look at Annie right away. His attention stayed fixed on the man in front of him, his expression calm but sharpened now, like something buried had just been forced to the surface. "You've made your point," he said quietly. You can leave." The man let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "That's not how this works," he replied. "You don't just walk away from everything and pretend it's gone." Annie felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't small. It wasn't something a man could simply outrun. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, the same kind Annie had glimpsed days before. Only this one wasn't hidden. He held it up just enough for James to see, his expression unreadable but confident. Your father's land," he said, almost casually. "Your name's still on it. Always was." A murmur rippled faintly through the room, though no one fully understood what was being said. Annie didn't either. Not completely. But she understood enough. Land meant power. Land meant money. And suddenly, the man who had walked into Pine Creek with quiet boots and a wounded arm didn't seem so simple anymore. James exhaled slowly, running a hand across his jaw, as if the past itself had just reached out and grabbed him. "I told you I wasn't interested," he said. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly, but not enough to keep Annie from hearing. "It's not about interest anymore. It's about ownership, responsibility. That ranch? It's yours now, whether you like it or not." Annie's breath caught. For a moment, everything seemed to tilt. The quiet man who sat alone, who spoke little, who wore his life like something temporary, was tied to something vast, something permanent, something powerful, and he had never said a word. James finally turned then, his eyes meeting Annie's for the first time since the men had arrived. There was something in that look she hadn't seen before. Not distance, not calm, but conflict. Like he knew what she was thinking. Like he knew what this changed. "I didn't come here for that," he said, his voice softer now, but still carrying. Annie didn't answer. She didn't know how to, because the truth had already settled in, heavy and undeniable. He hadn't lied to her, but he hadn't been honest either. And somewhere between those two things, something fragile had started to crack. Outside, the wind picked up again, and brushing against the cabin walls like a warning. Because whatever choice James made next wasn't just about him anymore. The tension in the cabin didn't fade when the rider finished speaking. It sharpened. Annie could feel it pressing against her chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. No one spoke. No one moved. All eyes were on James now. Not the quiet man who had walked in days ago, but the one standing in front of something he clearly couldn't outrun anymore. The rider took another slow step forward, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. "We've wasted enough time," he said calmly. "You're coming back with us." It wasn't a request. It never had been. Annie's fingers curled slightly at her sides as she watched James, waiting, hoping for him to say something that would make sense of all this. But he didn't look at her. Not yet. His gaze stayed locked on the man in front of him, his jaw tightening just enough to show the pressure building beneath his calm. "I said no," he replied quietly. The rider tilted his head, almost amused. "You don't get to say no anymore." That was when Annie stepped forward. The movement surprised even her, but once she did, she couldn't stop. "You should leave," she said, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her. The rider's attention shifted to her slowly, like she had just become something worth noticing. His eyes scanned her, quick, assessing. "And you are?" he asked. Annie didn't hesitate. "Someone who works here," she replied. It wasn't the full truth, but it was enough. The rider gave a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Then you should understand something," he said, his tone cooling slightly. "This doesn't concern you." Annie held his gaze anyway, So, it does, if you're bringing trouble into this place. For a brief moment, the room felt like it balanced on the edge of something dangerous. Then the rider's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough to reveal what sat beneath the calm. "Careful," he said quietly. "You don't know what kind of trouble you're talking about." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be, because the meaning behind them was clear enough. James moved then, fast, deliberate, stepping between them. "That's enough," he said, his voice firmer than Annie had ever heard it. There was no hesitation now. No quiet distance. Just decision. The rider studied him for a long second, before exhaling through his nose. "You always did have a habit of making things harder than they need to be," he muttered. James didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough to face Annie. And for the first time since the truth came out, he looked directly at her. Really looked. There was no hiding in his expression now. No distance. Just something raw, conflicted, and honest. "I didn't lie to you," he said quietly. Annie's chest tightened. "You didn't tell me the truth either," she replied, her voice softer now, but no less steady. The words hung between them, heavier than anything else in the room. James nodded once, like he accepted that. Because he did. Then, after a brief pause, he turned back to the rider. "I'll go," he said. The room shifted instantly, but James didn't stop there. "I'll go," he repeated, his voice steady. "But not because you told me to." His eyes hardened slightly, something stronger rising beneath the surface. "I'll settle what needs to be settled. On my terms." The rider watched him carefully, weighing the words, before giving a small, satisfied nod. "That's all we needed to hear," he said. But Annie felt it, the difference between what was said and what it meant. This wasn't over. Not even close. James stepped past the rider without another word, heading for the door. He paused only once, his hand resting briefly against the wood, before glancing back. Not at the room, but at Annie. There was something in that look, something unfinished, something that didn't have time to be said. And then he was gone, leaving behind silence and a choice that would change everything. The days after James left still carried the weight of his presence. Pine Creek hummed along in its usual rhythm, but for Annie, every sound, every movement, felt muted. Chairs scraped across floors. Men laughed a little too loudly. Horses clopped across the dusty streets. And yet, none of it touched her the way James had. Clara noticed her quiet moments, her lingering glances at the horizon. "Men leave," she said one evening, as if reading Annie's thoughts. Annie only nodded. This wasn't a man who left. This was a man who offered something real, then stepped aside, letting her decide. And that made the choice heavier than anything she had faced before. When he returned later that day, it wasn't with grandeur or announcement. James stepped into the cabin quietly, just as he had when Annie first saw him. But this time, something was different. The calm in his gait, the simplicity of his coat, the absence of any sign of wealth or concern. It was deliberate. He walked directly to her, holding her gaze with steady certainty. "Not anymore," he said. "I've walked away from it all. The fortune, the legacy, the life built on what people can take from you rather than who you are." His eyes softened. "I don't want any of it, Annie. I want a life that's real, with someone who sees me, not what I own." He reached into his coat and handed her a slip of paper. "Come live with me," he said quietly. "Start fresh. If you ever change your mind, ride south here. I'll wait for you." And just like that, he turned and left, leaving the cabin quieter than it had ever been. Later that night, Clara knocked on Annie's door, her voice gentle. "You're thinking about him," she said, reading the longing in Annie's eyes. Annie nodded slowly. Clara smiled softly. "If it's what your heart wants, then don't hold back," she said. The next morning, Annie moved with purpose. Well, she thanked Clara, paying her respects for the care, guidance, and quiet protection she had given her in Pine Creek. Then she mounted her horse, gripping the reins tightly, and set out for Denver's ranch. The wind rushed past her, carrying away the dust and the doubts. Every mile south felt like a step into a life she had only dared to dream about. A life built not on wealth or power, but on choice, trust, and love. And as the gates of Denver's ranch appeared on the horizon, Annie knew one thing with certainty. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Some people come into your life and leave footprints you can't ignore. Others come quietly, offering nothing but truth, and suddenly, everything changes. Well, Annie thought she had traveled across the country for a man she barely knew, only to be left with uncertainty and questions. But in the end, James Denver showed her something far greater than wealth or legacy. He offered a life built on honesty, choice, and love. He walked away from fortune, not because he didn't deserve it, but because he had learned the hard way that people often love what they can take, not who you are. And Annie? She chose to trust her heart, to step into the unknown, and to embrace a life that was real, unshaped by expectations or possessions. Together, they began a story written by their own hands, a life where love mattered more than gold, and freedom was measured by the choices they made, not what was handed down to them. If this story moved you, wait until you see the next one. Well, it's about a woman who was left hopeless with no option but to rob a cowboy just to save her kids. But her encounter with him changes everything. Tap the video on your screen now. You won't believe how far courage, love, and determination can take someone. Trust me, this is one story you don't want to miss.